Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We're going to be talking about why New Mexico needs a just transition from fossil fuels and false solutions. Now, everyone knows what fossil fuels are. Not everyone knows what false solutions are, but hopefully by joining this webinar today, you leave with an understanding of what false solutions are. We are very fortunate to be joined today by two organizers on the ground in New Mexico who are doing amazing work there. And later on, you'll be introduced to them and you'll get the opportunity to hear from them. But in the meantime, without further ado, first I'm going to just talk about a little bit of logistics. You will see a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen called Q&A. By clicking on that, you can type in a question that all the panelists and moderators can access. And we can't promise we'll get around to all of your questions, but hopefully we will have enough time for discussion at the end to get around to most of them. And before I pass it on to Ennedith Lopez, who you'll be hearing from, just a few words about the Institute for Policy Studies, if you're not familiar with us. We are one of the oldest multi-issue progressive think tanks in the country, dating back to the early 1960s. And we work on a wide range of domestic and foreign policy justice issues, whether it is demilitarization and a just foreign policy, or it's economic justice, racial justice, climate justice, etc. at home. And with that, I'm going to introduce Ennedith Lopez, who's going to talk about our recent report on New Mexico and a just transition. So Ennedith Lopez was born and raised in Albuquerque's International District, which has empowered her passion for community-based work and advocacy. She graduated from the University of New Mexico with a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies and Spanish. And then she became the 2021 through 22 New Mexico Fellow at IPS. The New Mexico Fellowship is a public policy fellowship housed in DC for a year. And then she spent the remainder of the 6 months of the fellowship working with a local organization in New Mexico. And during her time at IPS, she has conducted research for the Mining and Trade Justice in Latin America project and the Climate Policy project. And now she's at the New Mexico Environmental Law Center. And with that, on to Ennedith.
Thank you so much, Basav, and good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm just going to quickly share my screen so you are able to see my presentation. To begin, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen in on our report and the amazing organizers we have on the call today. I would also like to begin by recognizing the purpose of this report. We primarily want to emphasize a need to transition away from fossil fuels and promote community-led solutions to the climate crisis. Yet the fossil fuel industry pushes for market-based technologies that will continue to pollute our air, land, water, and communities in order to prolong the industry's livelihood and worsen the climate crisis. Within the environmental and climate justice movement, these solutions are also known as false solutions. In New Mexico, there have been a series of false solutions proposed, such as carbon capture and storage, hydrogen hubs, and nuclear energy and waste disposal storage. The climate crisis is dire. Global temperatures must remain below 1.5 degrees Celsius before the end of the century, and the IPCC calls for a phase out of fossil fuel use in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In the past year, New Mexico has experienced two of its largest wildfires in its history, the Calf Canyon and Hermit's Peak fire and the Black Forest fire. As of December 2022, it burned approximately 904,422 acres of land, and the dry and arid climate spurred these fires out of control. The state of New Mexico will continue to experience more wildfires, extreme heat temperatures, prolonged drought, and inland flooding as a result of the climate crisis. The image on the side depicts a drought in the midst of the beginning of the summer season and in the middle of the wildfire season. Unfortunately, these conditions are going to become a lot more common as the climate crisis continues to worsen due to the global gas emissions of the fossil fuel industry. The state of New Mexico has long been a site for oil, gas, and uranium extraction, treating the state, sovereign indigenous nations, and its communities as a sacrifice zone. According to data from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, oil and gas employs less than 2% of the overall workforce in the state, but entire communities are made dependent on the industry. There is extensive lobbying and monetary contributions from the fossil fuel industry and state politics. According to a report by New Mexico Ethics Watch, oil and gas was classified as the highest ranked industry in regard to political contributions during the 2020 election cycle, totaling to approximately $3 million. In 2019, it was reported that the fossil fuel industry was responsible for a total of 53% of greenhouse emissions in the state. In addition, polluting industries are not made responsible for the pollution and destruction of entire communities. In 1979, in Church Rock, New Mexico, the Rio Puerco River on the Navajo Nation was contaminated with 94 million gallons of uranium tailings and wastewater, radioactively contaminating the drinking water, soil, and crops for communities who lived along those rivers. Approximately 500 abandoned uranium mines remain to be cleaned up. And this was all done in the interest of building nuclear power and nuclear weapons for the United States. In terms of transitioning away from fossil fuels, sources of energy, access, and affordability also become a part of the equation. Most energy sources in New Mexico are derived from coal, natural gas, solar, wind, and nuclear. PNM accounts for 52% of the total customer utility distribution in New Mexico, and also has the highest rates set in the state in terms of customer payment. A transition from the monopoly of energy distribution and resources can challenge the dependence of fossil fuels and nuclear energy. Now, in order to resist powerful polluting industries such as oil and gas and nuclear energy, a just transition towards renewable energy is necessary. A just transition seeks not only for green solutions, but powerful shifts in the foundations of our economic, political, social, and environmental structures. A just transition is typically associated with Tony Mazzocchi, the leader of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, where they demanded for financial support and higher education opportunities to be given to workers transitioning out of polluting industries during the 1970s and during the rise of the peace movement. Simultaneously, the rise of the environmental justice movement in the 1980s, where Black, Indigenous, and people of color and low-income communities were experiencing environmental racism, a collaboration between union workers and environmental justice communities was developed, and the concept of a just transition was born. Now, the report outlines the principles of a just transition from the Just Transition Alliance, the Climate Justice Alliance, and the Indigenous Environmental Network. It is critical to remember that a just transition is an expansive concept, and it is unique to local conditions and both in the environmental and community needs of each region. So a just transition will not look the same for each region in the world. What works in New Mexico does not mean it's going to work in New York. So they're very unique to each situation and circumstance. Polluting industries and their political allies are pushing fall solutions in New Mexico. Carbon capture and storage and carbon capture utilization and storage are two common variants of a technology that claims to address climate change by removing carbon dioxide from the smokestacks of fossil fuel burning facilities and storing the captured carbon dioxide in the ground. In New Mexico, carbon capture was proposed during the 2022 legislative session through House Bill 205, Geologic Carbon Dioxide Sequestration Act. Although the bill died, it would have set the groundwork to establish CCS projects at the San Juan Generating Station, as it was seen as a candidate for federal funding despite the recent closure of the plant and the continuing after effects of decades-long pollution and contamination. The city of Farmington and Chant Energy Corporation failed to acquire the plant due to financial and technological uncertainty. Next, hydrogen hubs have also been proposed in the state. Hydrogen can be produced in two fundamental ways: through conversion of methane gas, which comes from fracked gas, and then transform into hydrogen, through chemical reactions with carbon dioxide as a byproduct, and also through electrolysis of water. As presented during the 2022 legislative session last year, House Bill 4, the Hydrogen Hub Development Act, was introduced to encourage hydrogen production and establish hydrogen hubs in the state and compete for federal funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law. Although it was heavily pushed by Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, the bills were tabled due to large public opposition. Despite it being shut down during the session, the governor issued an executive order announcing an MOU between a hydrogen hub development coalition with Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming in pursuit of that same federal funding, which is approximately $8 billion. Finally, nuclear energy has had a long historical legacy in the state of New Mexico. Nuclear energy creates radioactive waste, uses fossil fuels in mining processes, and pollutes local waterways. Although nuclear energy is not commonly used now in present day, in New Mexico, it has left an environmental impact on previous, present, and future generations to come. Yet New Mexico has been eyed as a site for waste disposal storage. In July of 2022, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission issued a final environmental impact statement in support of issuing Holtec International a license to construct an interim nuclear waste storage facility in Lea County, New Mexico. The facility's first phase would store 500 canisters of approximately 8,680 metric tons of nuclear waste for 80 reactor sites around the country. Over the course of time, around 10,000 canisters would be added. Hoodwinked on the Hot House serves as a publicly available resource to provide guidance in the fight for climate justice. Given the intersectional aspect of the climate crisis, change will require real solutions and must aim to change systemic drivers. Locally led and designed initiatives can provide the opportunity to build power through translocal networks and coalitions, seeking not only a solution to the climate crisis, but a transformational approach from an extractive economy. As outlined in the report, Jose de Luna Navarro, a former New Mexico fellow and current climate policy innovator with the SEMIA strategies, argues for the case of community-owned solar programs to better fund local economies, address communities' needs, and locally source our energy. This serves as an example of energy democracy, as also highlighted and mentioned in the report. In addition, efforts must be made to address decades-long environmental injustices. For example, the Uranium Cleanup Act presented in the last legislative session exemplifies an attempt to try to remediate and clean up pollution that has been left there for a really long time. Lastly, in the report, we recognize the work of the No Fall Solutions Coalition and their efforts on raising awareness regarding false solutions and greenwashing tactics from the fossil fuel industry. The coalitions consist of groups such as Pueblo Action Alliance, Southwest Organizing Project, Youth United for Climate Crisis Action, Los Jardines Institute, Earth Care, Indigenous Lifeways, and New Energy Economy. The coalition has provided training to communities through throughout the state of New Mexico in regards to the narrative of false solutions and how they can create their own organizing efforts and resistance to these false solutions. Most importantly, the coalition was extremely active during last year's legislative session in stating their opposition to hydrogen hubs and other false solutions throughout the state. Today, we get to hear from two organizers from the coalition, and very soon you'll be able to hear their insight. Evidently, corporate-backed top-down models will sacrifice entire communities and our environment because they aim to pursue their own profit interests, and they do not base their solutions on social and environmental needs. Yet localized solutions can be guided by models of a just transition, energy democracy, and follow the leadership of Indigenous frontline community-led efforts. In the report, we provide broad guidelines for policy. So not necessarily direct policy recommendations, but guidelines that could be followed. And they follow as such. For one, to begin following the leadership of communities in New Mexico who have been treated as sacrificial for a long time. To address climate change as a complex ecological and social crisis, instead of reducing it solely to a problem of carbon emissions. 3, phase out unjust polluting industries such as fossil fuels and nuclear energy in the state. 4, repair the historical harm that oil, gas, and nuclear energy have caused on BIPOC communities and low-wealth communities throughout the state, throughout the country, and throughout the world. 5, incorporate principles of a just transition and energy democracy into climate change policy. Expand real community ownership of renewable energy to challenge the monopoly over the distribution of energy. And lastly, explore the possibility of public ownership of the electric grid instead of relying on self-starting for-profit investor-owned utilities. That is all I have for you all today, and I will pass it back to my colleague, Basav. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ennedith. And Ennedith's presentation provided like a very short description of a really complex subject that has a lot of depth, which if we can boil down to one sort of overarching observation, it is that the transition away from harmful energy sources such as fossil fuels and nuclear energy is not just a technological shift. It is actually a profound political and cultural shift that cannot be done right and cannot be done with justice if it is done using the same colonialist, capitalist, patriarchal model that got us to where we are today. And with that, I'm going to introduce Tanea Garcia, who is our current New Mexico Fellow at IPS. She is from the Pueblo of Santa Ana and the Pueblo of Acoma in New Mexico. And she was born in Albuquerque and raised on the Pueblos, and that has influenced her passion for indigenous education, language reclamation, and community-based research and scholarship. She graduated from Lawrence University in Wisconsin with Bachelor of Arts degrees in anthropology and ethnic studies. And during her time at IPS, she has worked on written pieces with the Poor People's Campaign and recently contributed to work with the climate justice team on the report on just transition in New Mexico. And in her remaining months at IPS, she's excited to further develop her skills in public scholarship and policy to best serve her communities in New Mexico. And Tanea will introduce our two amazing guest speakers who we are really honored to have with us today, Alejandria and Julia. So on to you, Tanea.
Thank you, Basav, for that nice introduction. Working on this piece with Ennedith and learning from Julia and Josue and Alejandria in this report has been amazing. So it is my pleasure to introduce both our speakers, Alejandria and Julia. Alejandria Lyons is a Chicana organizer from Las Lunas, New Mexico. She is the former environmental justice organizer for the Southwest Organizing Project, SWAP, and the current coalition coordinator at the New Mexico No False Solutions Coalition located in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Alejandria has worked on environmental justice related topics through her position, working alongside food sovereignty activists across New Mexico and later water rights activists who aim to protect historic acequias. She received her master's in community and regional planning from the University of New Mexico, where she focused on environmental and indigenous planning issues. And Julia Bernal is a enrolled member of the Sandia Pueblo and is also from the Taos Pueblo and Uchee Creek Nations of Oklahoma. Julia is the director of Pueblo Action Alliance. She has her BA in English and Literature from the University of Redlands and currently is working towards her MA in Water Resources, Policy Management, and an MA in Community Regional Planning at the University of New Mexico. Her focus has remained on the oil and gas industry and how its adverse impacts affect the environment, the water, and the people. She advocates for the decolonization of water policy and stolen water resources. So, knowing who our panelist is, both of our panelists are, it's so great to finally be in a space where we can learn from them, and we will be transitioning now into our interactive panel discussion with both Alejandria and Julia, where we'll get more of their insights on what has went into this project and the stuff that they're working on. So the first question we have for you both today is, in what ways are Indigenous and frontline communities in New Mexico treated as sacrifice zones for fossil fuels, nuclear energy, carbon capture, hydrogen, and other fossil solutions? And what is the connection of these harmful industries to colonialism?
Yeah, I can go first. Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you all today. And of course, thank you to including our perspective at Pueblo Action Alliance in this very important report on just transition and what that means for New Mexico. And so in regards to the panel question, you know, Ennedith did a really great job of painting the landscape of New Mexico in terms of how ancestral indigenous lands have been exploited for natural resource extraction in the forms of oil and gas and uranium mining, those two particular natural resources that are still continuously elongating this extractive legacy throughout New Mexico. Historically, the San Juan Basin particularly, and that's like the northwestern corner of the state, had been deemed under the Nixon administration as a national energy sacrifice zone. Meaning that this landscape ultimately could be sacrificed for extractivism, which, you know, ultimately is propping up global capitalism and contributing to the transnational corporations that exploit labor and exploit resources in order to consolidate wealth with a small percentage of people. And so oil and gas and uranium mining on Indigenous lands and in near Indigenous communities has perpetuated long-term public health issues, a lot of that relating to very rare forms of cancer, upper respiratory issues, young people, you know, accumulating asthma, and also an epidemic of other social injustices like missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives. and just, you know, many other things that happens when violence of the land is happening. And so now in New Mexico, we're seeing a continuation of extractivism guised as climate initiatives in order to achieve climate goals, which is why there's a lot of scholarship and organizing efforts around the narrative false solutions. So corporations and also backed by government formations are now deeming energy infrastructure and technology like carbon capture, sequestration, hydrogen in the form in various forms and various colors, are now being, you know, are now these greenwashed initiatives that are ultimately going to elongate extractivism in New Mexico, but will be promoted as something that can reach climate goals. And so that's you know, something that I think is really important in terms of education to connect this to colonialism. A lot of times I think folks may not want to directly link colonialism to extractivism, but ultimately there is still a neoliberal and colonialist agenda to continue grabbing land and grabbing water to prop up the extractive industry still to this day. And so it behooves us to connect how colonialism and climate change are very much connected, especially in a landscape like the Southwest, which has a densely large population of Indigenous and people of color and historic environmental justice communities. And then also just the continued and expansion of new oil and gas infrastructure, and now with the introduction of hydrogen, blue hydrogen specifically, which is coupled with CCS, will also elongate coal fire plants and you know, other types of natural gas cultivation. So I'll go ahead and stop there and pass it to my colleague Alejandria, but you know, here to answer other questions as we go through the panel.
Yeah, I think Julia laid it out really well. Yeah, again, you know, my name is Alejandria. I mean, I am the coalition coordinator for New Mexico No Fall Solutions, and we're a 100% grassroots frontline group working with groups like Pueblo Action Alliance, Indigenous Lifeways, Youth United for Climate Crisis Action, Earth Care, Los Jardines Institute, and New Energy Economy. And I think that, you know, our evaluation of New Mexico being seen kind of like, you know, still as a colonial territory of the United States comes from the fact that, one, we've all experienced it in our communities. The only thing that I would add to what Julia said was the presence of the military in New Mexico. There is both Sandia and Los Alamos National Labs that have done much research on nuclear weapons, actually still manufacture weapons shipped to be across the world. You know, there are all the compact agreements, the water agreements, the Colorado Compact, the Rio Grande Compact. And a lot of these compacts were signed after New Mexico became part of the United States, so post 1912. But as Julia mentioned, you know, there was a lot of the acequia groups that were active, the Pueblos, and other indigenous nations such as the Apache and Dene folks who were here, right? And these are their ancestral homelands. These are like where folks have been for many, many years living a subsistence lifestyle. And so for the US to come in and to take a hold of water, to separate land and water, it was very detrimental to many of the historic cultures that, you know, this is their homelands. And, you know, the thing about oil and gas in New Mexico that I want folks to understand that, you know, I haven't found in a lot of places is, unfortunately, it is such a large part of our economy, and our politicians seem to continue to let that paradigm happen without thinking that we can, again, look at invest in the good, what is actually part of New Mexico, which is embedded into our culture, right? Because oil and gas is the major funder of all levels of education. At this point, it also funds early college education too, right? So I just, wanted to add that to the discussion and talk about, the fact that, a lot of folks call this like the supply side of the oil and gas economy, but, it needs to be called out as extraction for what it is.
Thank you so much, both Julia and Alejandria, for your insights on that question. The second question that we have for you both is, what is your vision of a just transition from these extractive and harmful systems, and what kinds of work are you doing to turn that vision into a reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I really want to thank the Institute for Policy Studies for, laying out some of the solutions, which are things such as community-owned solar, because, a lot of times we say solar and wind, right? But I think that that does need to be coupled with the fact that we are asking for community-owned renewables. There's a lot of programs right now that the federal government is pushing down through the Inflation Reduction Act, for what became the Build Back Better, and also funding communities, what communities are asking for, because again, climate justice is environmental justice, and we need to continue to keep the tenets of environmental justice, such as those that were created by the First People of Color Summit. And I think it's really important that even as federal investment is coming down, that the folks who have access to this, I know Los Jardines Institute has been doing a great job talking about Justice 40 and making sure that community members are at the table, because, we have to listen to the community, because the reason why the caveat of community-owned solar is really important, and community-owned renewables in general in New Mexico is important, is because right now you can have solar panels on your home in New Mexico. But who owns the energy and who owns the grid? It's PNM. It's a publicly traded company, right? And they don't always have New Mexico's best interest in mind. Same thing when in Cuesta, like what we're seeing with Chevron, and we're seeing them wanting to push green hydrogen, and they're saying it's clean, right? It's carbon neutral. It's and it's a false solution, because it prolongs the industry for oil and gas, and it prolongs us and keeps New Mexicans and really anybody in this cycle of keeping us tied to this harmful extractive industry. So I will say that, and then, bringing grassroots folks to the table has to be number one. And our politicians have to adopt strong stances, because we cannot continue to use the same polluters that put us into this industry to prop us out of it.
Yeah, I can go ahead and continue. Building off of what Alejandria is saying in terms of really propping up community-based solutions and community engagement, because ultimately the climate crisis is something that we did not all consent to, and did not agree that we would sacrifice clean air and clean water and soil to continue accumulating revenue from that type of industry. We're in the New Mexico legislative session right now, and a lot of what's been talked about in the debate is the need for economic diversification. So, everybody knows that, everybody's been saying it, but ultimately we also need to figure out how we're going to sever our dependence on oil and gas revenue. New Mexico is, very proud of the money that they make from oil and gas, and there's a lot of like, speculation on like, where does all of that money really go to? Being that, a lot of oil and gas states also are really low on the education spectrum and public health spectrum. And so, we often have to like ask, well, where is a lot of this revenue actually going to? But I think one thing that I'll just add is that, and I mentioned this earlier, is, we have this historic legacy of oil and gas extraction. And so why not create an economy that's around cleanup and remediation? There's a really interesting study that came out a couple of years ago by Kelly O'Donnell, and it's called The Economic Impact of Oil Field Remediation in New Mexico. And a lot of what that report is really saying is that you can create a state economy around remediation and cleanup. The state could inject like 8.2 billion, this is what the report is saying, but can inject over $8.2 billion into the New Mexico economy and support over 65,000 jobs, up to 3 years of employment for about 21 plus thousand New Mexicans. And so, while like the revenue that this could generate is around like $540 million, that's just an avenue that I think we could go towards in terms of creating economies around care, around remediation, and actually achieve a phase out of fossil fuels. I saw there was a question in the chat on, can we really phase out fossil fuels? And it's not if we can, it's a matter of we need to take bold climate action and bold steps towards phasing out fossil fuels. I mean, that's what the IPCC report is saying. And that's a global initiative. It's telling nation states across the world to start thinking about how they're going to phase out fossil fuels in order to reach real climate goals, reach real zero, or at least near zero emissions. So that way we can actually start seeing, the Earth Mother start to heal herself. So, I'll just stop there, and happy to, answer other questions or other ideas. But ultimately, we have to think outside of like what the dominant paradigm, and I think Basav was, alluding to that earlier, is that we have to think outside capitalism. We have to think outside of transnational corporations and global trade and made up markets like carbon pricing that really is just trading paper credits rather than actually cutting emissions at the source. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you both for your insights on both of the questions. I'm sure that everyone in this webinar right now, and including myself, learned so much from you and all of your answers in that. So I'm thankful for all of the information and insights that you're sharing with us. And with that, we are going to sort of transition to a Q&A portion of the webinar. We mentioned at the beginning, if people do have questions, that it would be helpful just for us not to miss any of the questions, if you can put them in the Q&A portion of the Zoom. It's located on the bottom of your screen. And yeah, we'll start with that. So the first question we have coming from the Q&A is, which NM legislators may be the most able to listen to opposing interest if just transition is not their priority at this time?
So we have a couple folks that different organizational partners of No False Solutions have been working with. Representative Allison is one of the House representatives here in New Mexico that helped to bring the San Juan cleanup bill, which is essentially holding P&M accountable to not retire in place, but rather get a second opinion, so that, we make sure that the San Juan River is not covered in coal ash, because those of us here in Albuquerque, we get some of our water piped in from San Juan, but also it's vital to the community that lives there. And it's vital to, we always talk about these public-private partnerships, but the private part of these partnerships needs to hold up their part of the agreement, which is to make sure that the land is not damaged, and really in better condition than they left it, right? We've also been working, New Energy Economy works really closely with Carrie Hamblin on folks who are doing local choice energy. Surprisingly, we've had, not so many allies in the House Environment and Natural Resource Committee, but there are a few. I just, want to say that there's some folks who have been fighting for water leasing to make the to stop the streamlined process for oil and gas to operate on some of the with like a temporary water permit without proving water rights or having the water rights, because you have to have water rights to open up and operate business in New Mexico. And this would be a streamlined process. I think it's House Bill 121, which is the Water Leasing Act, to make sure that we are meeting what our compacts originally said they are, and that, we are including Indigenous water rights holders and Aseka users. So there's a couple different people in there, but it unfortunately in New Mexico, because many of our politicians are bought out from oil and gas, they're very far and few between, but there are some good ones out there. But yeah, definitely shout out to Representative Allison, Carrie Hamblin, and others.
Yeah, thank you for that. The second question we have is relating to the Economic Transition Act by Ryan. It's introduced as HEB 188, and they're wondering if it is an example of a potential just transition or false solutions.
So I will say some of the folks who are working on House Bill 188, the Economic Transition Act, that's more powerful in them. They've been having a lot of conversation with folks down south. I think that, in our analysis of it so far, I would say, it hasn't been super thorough, because we haven't been a part of those conversations necessarily. But I think that it's important, because we do have to include our workers. I think our workers are part of the just transition. And I think that, a lot of the folks, especially here in New Mexico, our Native Indigenous allies, as well as folks who are down south that are have migrated from Central and South America, Mexico. And so I think that this is important, as it starts to think about workers and how we can do that. So I wouldn't call it a false solution. I think that, this aims to do, something really ambitious and take a hold of some of those federal funds. I will say, though, that, in general, no problems with the bill, but in general, we have to be very careful as we look at these federal funds, because things like Justice 40 do allow for hydrogen, right? And so this would be to set up a just transition office, and we have to make sure that office is being accountable to our community. So I think it's just a bill that we have to stay on top of. I think it could be a potential model. I know that they've tried to do it in California, and California's had mixed results, but we have to try. And I think that it's really important that we stay a part of the process, because, as Richard Moore, one of our elders in the movement, would say, if you are not at the table, you're probably on the menu.
Yeah, great questions. And Julia touched upon this a little bit earlier, but I'm just gonna ask it again. From Charles, can sustainable non-extractive activities really replace revenues from fossil fuels? By when?
Yeah, I can go ahead and just continue that conversation. I mean, I can't say that I have like an economic model right in front of me that says like this is the time, but according to the IPCC reports and other sort of scientific findings around climate and global temperature, it has to be now. It has to be, something soon. Otherwise, we're just going to see global, climate cataclysmic events happening. You know, like it's definitely impacts that folks, our relatives from island communities are experiencing and coastal communities are experiencing. But I don't think that it's wrong to think outside of like what this dominant paradigm actually is. And unfortunately, it revolves around global capitalism and global trading and a neoliberal sort of agenda. In terms of sustainability, I think that, you know, what is sustainability, that's yet to be really defined a lot because, you know, sustainability could also sort of insinuate that like we have to, like, we don't have to give up like our conveniences or anything like that, but we are at a, we're at a tipping point. And so we have to think about like how we're going to change the overall economic makeup of the world and stop appeasing to a global minority and that wealth that's consolidated there and really think about community-based solutions. I think that, you know, New Mexico is a really amazing example of traditional communities creating micro and community-based economies that meet their needs, not necessarily the wants that, you know, we all are achieving to get because of like how capitalism like creates propaganda around that. But we're ultimately trying to push an agenda that allows for communities to create the solutions that are going to work for them and, you know, the generations that come behind them. And I don't think it's wrong to think that long term or to think that big, because we're in a place where we are going to have to take radical action. And it's really great that there's people like, you know, in this space here that are critically thinking about how we're going to achieve that. Can't say when that would happen, but it is something that I think a lot of us really do would like to eventually see happen.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the next question we have is from Ashley. Could you expand on how community-owned solar power would work? Sounds like an incredible idea for New Mexico. Hashtag sunshine state.
Yeah, I think it's like 360 days because, you know, we have a pretty cloudy winter in New Mexico. But right now, the bill is local choice energy. It's a model that is being used across the nation. I think New York News actually has a similar model. But it's opening up the door for folks to, you know, own their own grids, to invest in their own regional solar. It could be getting investment from some of these federal infrastructure funds. But it's basically allowing to open up the percent of the portfolio away from just PNM, right? The Santa Fe County just unanimously passed the same bill. I'm trying to get the bill number for folks. But it's basically to diversify and let New Mexicans choose where they want to get their energy from, right? Because we have a monopoly here in New Mexico. PNM is pretty much the only provider. And it's also a little intimidating because, you know, PNM is in the middle of trying to merge with Avangrid, which is another huge corporate conglomerate, I believe also in Spain. And, you know, the thing is that we want to get out of this paradigm where New Mexico is selling energy to other places instead of, you know, coming and localizing our energy grid. This was open it up also for tribes and other indigenous nations to take a hold of it. Yes, I think actually Sophia Jenkins Neto brought it. It's a Senate Bill 165 for local choice energy. But to sell like rural co-ops, even back to other counties, right? So indigenous nations, rural co-ops, but it opens the door to have a choice, right? That's why it's a choice. So for folks that want to learn more about that, please look up publicpower.nm.org. They're really leading the charge in that and has been a partner. But yeah, I think Uprose and a lot of folks have been trying to do this, and it's really important because, as Julia was talking about, essentially, degrowth, we have to localize our energy sectors, and so I think this is a really important bill to look out for if you're here in New Mexico.
Great. And some of the next questions relate to what New Mexico residents can do with addressing this. And additionally, another person in the chat, Carmen, had asked how younger people can get involved in certain major community-based work and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that without young youth climate action, I don't think we would get as far as we've gotten with a lot of our own, climate initiatives and agenda. It really is the youth pushing a more progressive and radical position on climate, because it's ultimately young people's futures that are at stake, and therefore their voice needs to be centered in these types of discussions. I will say that Yucca, Youth United for Climate Action, are doing amazing work in the Santa Fe area in terms of bringing more awareness around young people's perspective and analysis on climate initiatives here in New Mexico. And then, I'll also have to plug Pueblo Action Alliance too. We have a youth fellow program each year to, try and ensure that our young Pueblo people are also engaging in this work as much as they want to. And so I think that young people, if there's an organization that you're interested in, like join it as much as you can. If not as a volunteer or as a as a steering committee, or just even showing up for actions or different things like that. I think that's really important. I think it's always important to join an organization at any capacity to continue building power in that sort of way. And there's many other youth organizations throughout New Mexico that focus on different other different issues, like social issues, which are an intersection of climate justice. And so any of those organizations that young people want to get involved with, I highly encourage for them to do that.
Yeah, and I just plugged in the chat my email, as well as the website for New Mexico No Fall Solutions, with many of those groups that Julia mentioned. But there's a lot of groups in New Mexico, I think, that are doing really good work. And I think that, it's best to get started in your community, and also start talking to the elders and folks in your community. I always encourage that. I think it's really important to even take an inquiry of the issues in your community and come together. That's that real grassroots organizing.
Yeah, thank you both for answering all of these amazing questions that we have and sharing your insights. We want to give you time to address how we can support you, how people both within and outside of New Mexico can support the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I think what for me, one of the biggest things is adopting this no false solutions narrative is extremely important to prop up the work, not just in New Mexico, but other states that are fighting against hydrogen, CCS, and of course, oil and gas and liquid natural gas. And, there's so much happening throughout the state. But I think that by adopting a no false solutions narrative, it really does bring all of the issues together under, this narrative that denounces and debunks greenwashing and other market-based mechanisms that we don't feel and don't see is going to adequately address climate mitigation. And, you know, following the New Mexico No False Solutions Coalition and supporting that work is also going to really help, display the power that we have been building, over time. I really want to thank you all as well as CJA, Climate Justice Alliance, and Indigenous Environmental Network, and Global Grassroots Justice Alliance for also standing with us, beside us, Just Transition Alliance, of course, and the Hoodwinked and the Hot House working group have all really stood beside us in terms of amplifying this no false solutions narrative, which is extremely important to the organizing efforts here on the ground in New Mexico. If there are those that want to connect, with our organizations, with our coalition, more than happy to do so, because, we're organizers, and we're also trying to form our analysis, but we don't know everything. And so if there's any different types of helpful information and analysis that could also be utilized in our fights here, would love to learn more about that. And again, just appreciate the support from our allies and accomplices that really do believe in this work and really do want to see that that radical change around climate action. I think it's really important. So thanks.
Okay, I just want to step in right at the end to say a huge thank you to our guests, Alejandria and Julia, for sharing so much of their wisdom with us today. And also a huge thank you and appreciation to my two young colleagues, Ennedith and Tanea. I very much wanted, as the senior person on this team at IPS, I very much wanted the younger folks to take leadership in today's webinar, which they did amazingly well. So, I want to say, a big thank you to all four of you today, and to our audience for staying engaged with us throughout. And, please join us for subsequent IPS events as well. And please follow the work of Pueblo Action Alliance and the New Mexico No False Solutions Coalition. And in general, please follow the work for environmental justice and a just transition in New Mexico and everywhere else. Okay, with that, thank you, everyone.